All right, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining today's Lesson Study Institute pre-training webinar. My name is Liberty Van Atten, and I'm the project specialist for the California Adult Education Program Technical Assistance Project. Before we begin today, I'm just going to go over some general housekeeping, make sure everything moves semi-smoothly. So you all probably are very familiar, but you don't need to call in if you have speakers or a headset. And if you can't hear, click on the speaker icon on the top left of your screen, and you're going to change a little white speaker to a green speaker. The resources are available in the handouts pod at the bottom right of your screen. You just select the file and then select download. In the top right of your screen, you're going to find the communications menu, and you can open that menu by clicking on the arrow to view different options, and an icon will appear beside your name in the attendee list. And at the bottom drop-down menu of the pod for chat options, you can enter in text at the bottom. You can click the message bubble or enter to send and share it with everyone. And if you're attending with other colleagues from your site, would you please type in the chat pod the names of who they are, but they haven't necessarily logged in. And if you have entered your name with some sort of acronym, could you please put your name in there as well? And just as a reminder, this webinar is going to be recorded and will be available for future viewing on the California Adult Education website. If you need technical support during this session, use the chat pod to ask for help. So without further ado, I'm going to hand things over to Marian Thatcher from AIR to introduce our presenter today and get things started.
Thanks, Liberty, and thanks everyone for being here, and welcome. We're happy to have this second webinar on lesson study with Jacques Lecour, and I want to introduce you to Jacques. He has a strong background in innovative professional development, as you'll know very well by the end of this hour and 15 minutes. He was the coordinator of the Mid-Alameda County Consortium for Adult Education, and before that he was a leader at CalPro, which is the professional development organization for adult education in California. He also spent 5 years as an administrator at Oakland Adult and Career Education, and before that spent a couple of decades with Mount Diablo Adult Education as an ESL teacher, program coordinator, and administrator. He's taught in teacher credentialing programs and consulted on numerous state and national adult education projects. But his professional passion continues to be the development and support of disciplined professional learning communities and especially with the use of lesson study. So we will we will learn a lot about lesson study from Jacques today. Jacques?
Thank you, Marian, and thanks, Liberty, and welcome everyone. Thanks for spending a little bit of the afternoon together today. As Marian just said, professional learning has been my professional passion for a long time, and I am finally getting this opportunity to spread the word about lesson study, which is a really incredible approach to professional learning, and I hope that by the end of the Institute you'll be prepared and inspired to implement lesson study in whatever work context you may be working in. I'd also like to point out that on the webinar today is my dear friend and colleague Sue Pon, and you will get to meet Sue virtually during the face-to-face session where she'll join the Institute electronically as a voice from the field kind of perspective, and she'll be sharing some lessons learned from her own implementation and support of lesson study when she was at Oakland Adult and Career Education. So thanks for being with us today too, Sue. And as a reminder, I hope everyone has registered for the face-to-face session in addition to this webinar. The Institute consists of two parts. It's this webinar and the April 17th session. So you'll need to attend both to get all of the content. So please remember to sign up for the face-to-face training if you haven't done so already. And as of now, we're about, I think, 4 or 5 registrations shy of the minimum needed to actually go through with the training. So again, another bit of encouragement to sign up and encourage colleagues too. As you may know from looking at the information you've seen so far, we are really encouraging people to attend in teams. So if you need to or want to add to your teams, please do so. We can be sure to follow through with the face-to-face training on the 17th. So to get started, I'd like to ask how many of you are teachers or administrators, and let's start with teachers. If you're a teacher, would you please raise your hand? If you see that little icon on the top ribbon with the little guy with his hand raised up. If you're a teacher, could you click on the raised hand and identify yourself as a teacher? All right, Angela, John. Okay, if you could put your hands down, please. Thanks. If you're an administrator, would you please put your hand up? All right, so I don't see any. So there are others. Would you mind typing in the chat pod what your role is? Okay, Dana is an administrator. Let's see, I think Carla and Michelle, did we hear from you? Okay, an advisor. All right, great. And an outreach specialist. Great, okay. Academic advisor, wonderful. Okay. Administrators and program facilitator and vice principal. As usual, wearing a lot of hats in adult ed, Dana. Yeah. Okay, great. Thank you. Now I have a little sense of who you are. Let's see. Liberty, would you open the chat pods, please? And we're going to start by asking you participants to respond to these 2 questions. So you hear the term professional development or professional learning all the time, but what exactly does that mean? What is it that makes these experiences professional? And what does professional mean to you in terms of professional development? So if we could take a minute and get a little brainstorm going, please enter whatever comes to mind for you in the chat pods. All right, thanks for your responses, Dana. Everyone else, please chime in. Feel free to add your thoughts or comments, or even if you have a question that fits into these chat pod categories. Okay, so in what does professional mean? I see improving craft, boosting student learning, refining skills for best outcome for learners, helping students in a fully supported holistic way from Tom, educators who study development from Angela, and then what's effective differentiated PD where teachers have choices in the sessions they attend, so not a one-size-fits-all kind of approach. Okay. All right, we'll take just another comment or two. Thank you for those thoughts, and we'll come back to some of those thoughts in just a minute. I see another comment or two coming in. All right, Michelle, creating the context that we are skilled educators for professional development, improving and refining our skill set. Okay, great. Thank you so much for those thoughts. And as I said, we'll return to them in a second, but let's first review the objectives of today's webinar. So I hope by the end of the session, you'll be familiar with the basic steps and the key elements of the lesson study process, and have a really good sense of what teachers learn during lesson study, in addition to what they do during those basic steps. I have a good sense of what the benefits of lesson study will be and the challenges as well, always two sides of the same coin. And then starting to think about the logistics for implementing lesson study as you begin to think of how it might play out in your work context, and mostly prepare for taking full advantage at the face-to-face training. So this is going to be a little bit of a primer that will help you hit the ground running at the face-to-face training, where we'll be working on putting together a draft of an implementation plan for establishing lesson study at your sites. All right, I hope that you got a chance to look at these quick videos that you were asked to spend a little time looking at. Can I see another show of hands just to get a sense of how many of you did have time to look at the videos? Just like to know if I can go a little faster or a little slower, depending on how many people actually had a chance to see. Okay, I don't see a lot of hands up there, so I might do a little more explaining. Okay, all right, thanks. All right, so thinking about the qualities and the characteristics of effective professional development. Some of these things are very similar to what you mentioned in the chat pods, but let me highlight a couple of the items here. The first bullet and the last bullet, experiential and classroom focused, are pretty closely related. It seems like the most effective professional development has a very clear action component in the classroom, really getting the learning down to the application phase, application opportunity of actually putting into practice what it is that has been learned. Also, it's collaborative and it's supported. Working in isolation isn't nearly as effective as working with a group of other interested educators as well, and doing that in a safe and supported way makes it possible for the work to move along in an effective manner. Embedded and sustained means that the most effective professional development takes place on the job and at the work site. Not that there isn't a place, of course, for conferences and workshops, but again, the most powerful professional learning occurs when you're actually practicing it and keeping at it over time. Benefiting students and educators, that seemed to be a little bit of a theme in the comments. And then using data and measuring outcomes, very important for a focus on professional development that really does work for teachers and for students. And then research to practice, utilizing the best stuff out there to inform your own practice for refinement and continuous improvement, as you mentioned in the chat pod. So I think what we'll see is that lesson study really hits on all of these points and is very similar to, in fact, is a type of professional learning community. Following the professional teaching and learning cycle. This handout, I believe, was emailed to you in advance. It is also available in the handouts that Liberty pointed out at the beginning of this webinar. So if it's a little difficult to see on the screen, please feel free to refer to your hard copy or print it out now if that's an option for you. So just about any professional development activity that is truly effective is going to follow this this cycle. And so let's see, I'm going to start here with a focus on data. So we're going to assume that you already have a team that is ready to collaborate. And the first thing that they do is focus on data. And data means not only the traditional kind of data that you might get from test results and demographic information, but also what you know about what students struggle to learn and what teachers struggle to teach. That professional wisdom is part of the data that you look at. And then moving from there, you study standards and agree on student learning expectations relative to the topics that you are looking at and talking about that you find, again, challenging for students to learn and generally challenging for teachers to teach. And then once you have narrowed down a topic to work on based on that data review and discussion of what's challenging for students and teachers, then you select instructional strategies and resources to meet the expectations of the group in terms of the goals that have been identified for students and for teachers in the teaching and learning cycle. So in selecting, you're figuring out which materials are best, which instructional approaches work best regarding the topic that has been chosen, and with in mind the specific students in the classes that you are currently teaching. Having done those couple of steps, then you move on to planning lessons. The lessons should include an assessment, which is really critical for showing the extent and the details of student learning. Implementing the plan essentially just means teaching it and observing it. And then moving from there to analyzing the student work that was generated as a result of the practice activities or assessment activities that were built into the plan. And that is also the time to reflect on how well the plan worked? Did students learn to the extent that the collaborative team expected or not? If so, what worked? If not, what didn't work? And then using the results from that kind of discussion, you adjust instruction or adjust plans to make sure that you have refined your product and your learning to the extent that helps you meet the outcomes that you had originally set out to do. So I wanted to share this just by way of saying that any professional learning initiative worth its salt is going to cover all of those bases, whether it's lesson study or professional learning community or anything else. Again, that's to share the background of sort of standards and principles for excellent professional development. So let me thank you, Liberty, for opening this chat pod. So what I just described really focuses on that experiential and job-embedded kind of professional learning initiative. So what does that mean in terms of where conferences and workshops fit in? Could you please enter into the chat pod your thoughts about how workshop and conference participation fit into that teaching and learning cycle that we just reviewed? So I encourage all of you to share whatever thoughts come to mind about how workshop and conference participation fits into a teaching and learning cycle. Okay, I think we're playing Stump the Participants. So let me just go. Okay, Angela, good. Thank you for sharing a thought or an idea. All right, thank you, Angela and Dana, for those thoughts. And I am going to say that both of you are exactly right. Let's see, Liberty, could we go back to the full slide there? Thank you very much. So where do conferences and workshops fit in? If you see this box here called Focused Professional Development, that means that whatever members of the collaborative team need to learn in order to carry out the cycle better, then you go out and get that information. So I think Angela said conferences fit at the beginning, the middle, and the end, and that's absolutely right. For example, if you needed more learning or information about data, types of data to use, how to analyze data, that's the kind of session you might attend. If you're looking at working in the study phase and You want more information about curriculum or standards. That's the type of workshop or conference you would attend. And on for instructional strategies. If that was something that if learning something about instructional strategies would contribute to your participation and contribution in the collaborative team, that's the kind of session you would attend. So the bottom line message here is that even though the teaching and learning cycle really focuses on what happens in the team and in the classroom, the learning outside is really important to contribute well to what happens during the cycle. So, but the shift is it causes the team members to be more intentional about what conferences and workshops they choose to attend, so that it has a specific connection to the work that they're doing in the initiative. So it's kind of making sure that the tail doesn't wag the dog, that the conference itself isn't the center of the professional learning initiative, it's the support for the professional learning initiative. That's a way of sort of wrapping up what that chart is saying and what this focus on professional development box is all about. Okay, a few things about lesson study before we actually get into a little more detail about the stages and the steps. And I wanted to share a few things that I think are really important to keep in mind in order to frame what you hear for the rest of the webinar. The first thing is that even though developing a research lesson looks like and feels like the primary activity of lesson study, it is not the main point or the main product. It's just the vehicle for improving student learning through the teacher learning. So it's very important to distinguish the activity of creating a research lesson from the objective of doing lesson study. One of the main objectives is to improve individual practice, and that means that in constructing research lessons together and trying those research lessons in the classroom, there's a lot of opportunity to choose from among a lot of materials, a lot of strategies, draw from different research, and that starts to become ingrained in all of the participants and starts to affect individual practice. And that's really the main point of lesson study, not developing the research lesson. Another important thing to keep in mind is that lesson study focuses on really important and major concepts and standards and curricular items. So it really tries to focus on important stuff that students struggle with and that teachers feel it is worth spending time with to get better at, to refine practice in order to make sure that students are truly grasping the essential learning better than in the past. Collaboration is also just a tremendous key for lesson study. It's really about deprivatizing practice in a safe environment and learning from each other. One of the phrases that I really like in the literature about professional learning, and in particular about lesson study, is learning from the expert next door, your trusted colleague who uses the same, encounters the same kinds of issues and has the same kinds of needs that you do as an instructor, and are willing to participate in an open sharing environment. Another extremely important thing about lesson study to keep in mind throughout is the practice of anticipating student thinking, which is a key element of lesson study. When the team is putting the research lesson together, for every key step of the lesson, there is a conscious step of predicting what students will say and what students will do, including what students might say or do based on misconceptions of whatever is being taught, and thinking about how to respond both to responses that indicate real learning and responses that indicate continuing struggling with the learning. It's an aspect of professional learning that really separates and differentiates and elevates lesson study from many others. It's quite a skill to develop, and one that is much more likely to be well developed as a team as opposed to as an individual teacher. So to recap those things that I'd like you to keep in mind, the lesson study itself is just the lesson itself is just a vehicle. It's not really the end product at all. Lesson study targets really important student challenges. It requires collaboration and structured teamwork. And then finally, learning to anticipate student thinking leads to more skillful and intentional planning of lessons. And that's really the primary outcome. This is a graphic from the lesson study group at Mills College, and these are the essential steps of lesson study. What is not here is putting a team together. This graphic assumes that the team has already been constructed. During the face-to-face portion of the initiative, we'll spend actually a lot of time on the ins and outs and of putting a team together. But essentially, you'll see that these stages are very, very similar to the stages that we saw in that earlier graphic of the entire teaching and learning cycle. This slide is a synopsis of essentially what's coming over the course of the next 7 or 8 slides. So we'll be talking kind of simultaneously about what teams do during the stages of lesson study and what they learn during the stages. So I'll probably focus on the learning a little bit more, but please keep in mind that the whole thing is a learning by doing proposition. Okay, so what do teachers learn in the lesson study cycle? These are sort of the big ticket items. They improve their content knowledge because they are studying exactly what it is that students are struggling with, and often deepen their knowledge about what they're teaching. They learn instructional skills and planning skills through the development of the shared collaborative research lesson. They get a much better idea of how students think and learn because of the constant need to anticipate student thinking and the opportunity to observe how students think and learn during the teaching of the research lesson. A good amount of attention is paid to assessment strategies to be built into the research lesson, and facilitation skills and effective collaboration skills through the use of this structured effort and the use of protocols that go along with it to make sure that each step and each phase unfolds in the most positive and productive and efficient way. Okay, so let's start with the study phase, and let's take a look at what's happening in the study phase. So the team here is trying to make an informed decision about what to focus on for the lesson study cycle. So they're answering the question, of all the things that are challenging for students to learn and for us to teach, what should we focus on? What's a smart target for us to address? So they look at data, they look at their own practice and experience, and essentially ask the question, what topics or skills are important and persistently challenging for students, and that we find challenging to teach as well. And then in studying, the teams look at best practices around materials and instruction, the most up-to-date information and thinking regarding the topic or skill that they're working on. There's a deepening of the subject matter knowledge that just naturally occurs as part of that process. Broadening the instructional techniques and assessment techniques, because that's also reviewed as part of the study phase. Textbooks, journals, articles, manipulatives and other learning aids, all kinds of things that could contribute to the development of a great research lesson. All of those things are studied during the study phase, and this is where a good bit of learning occurs for the participants, meaning the teachers who are part of the team. And how about for the planning phase? In the planning phase, this is when the teams actually develop the research lesson, and that's a lesson that incorporates the most applicable parts of their own expertise, plus what they've studied, to create this collaborative lesson plan that will later be taught by at least one of the members, while the other members observe how students respond and whether they respond as expected. So in this phase, there's an encouragement for experimentation with a nod towards good practices, of course, and a lot of attention paid in predicting students' responses. So this gets at the deeper dive that lesson study requires, which is that increased awareness and skill in selecting materials and prompts that result in the clearest evidence of students' learning. So you're determining the intended student behavior for each action the teacher takes during the research lesson, and then for each intended behavior, you anticipate what types of difficulties students may have. And I want to share a quote from a teacher who participated in lesson study. She said, "It's challenging to try and think about the students' solutions to the problem before they do it, and to try to get all of the answers they might come up with. Before we did lesson study, we really didn't think about what the students' responses would be to the questions. It was, well, we hope they get the right answer, and if they don't, then we'll deal with it. Now we're really thinking about, well, what if this answer were to come up? How would we deal with it? We think a lot more about the intention of the lesson and making sure that the students have the prior knowledge that they need before we teach each lesson." That's a quote from a teacher who participated in lesson study. So how do you anticipate students' responses? Well, they try the tasks themselves. They might even have a team member experiment by having their students do the task and report back to the group. You can ask an expert colleague for feedback on the task. There are various ways to get at anticipating student responses, and a tremendous amount of learning comes out of that process. Next, in the teaching and observation phase, one team member delivers the research lesson while the others carefully observe students' reactions and responses. The observation itself is a data collection activity, and this will become probably the richest data that comes out of the process because it tells so much about student learning relative to lesson planning and lesson delivery. That the best data is almost always that in-the-moment classroom-based data. We always hear about formative data and how important it is for teachers to have so that they can modify instruction almost immediately in response to analyzing formative data. Through lesson study, you get layers of formative data. And the dimension that individual teachers can't get on their own is data about exactly how students are interacting with the content of the lesson. So the team members who are the fellow team members of the person who is teaching the lesson are carefully observing what students say and do. They are recording it. They are observing conversations among students during practice activities, recording all of those things. And later in the reflect stage, they look at all of that data together, and that's where the opportunity for analyzing the effectiveness of the lesson really comes to the fore. A really important thing to point out and to take in about lesson study is that it is truly focused on the student and the lesson. It is not focused on the teacher. So there sometimes can be a little bit of trepidation about being observed and a little bit of reservation, feeling that you might be evaluated as the teacher who is presenting the research lesson. But when lesson study is conducted well and conducted properly, that simply doesn't happen. And the reason is that lesson study goes out of its way to be student-focused and lesson-focused. So as people are observing the research lesson, the only thing they are observing are things to answer the question, did the students respond to our plan as we expected? If not, why not? What they do instead? What could we do differently if we think we need to do it better to ensure that students will respond as expected? This is a really critical component of lesson study. It helps keep the right dynamic in the group. It helps keep a spirit of experimentation and checking to see what works, and it takes the lens off of the individual teacher who just happens to be the one presenting the research lesson. Another quote from a teacher who went through a lesson study cycle, lesson study helped me see the lesson from the perspective of students by having observers see beyond what the teacher can see while in the midst of teaching. That's a big part of what occurs during the observation and debriefing. Let's see. Actually, I'm going to go back a second here. Yeah. Okay. One big result that is common among lesson study teams is that teachers start to intentionally create practice activities that require students to show and to demonstrate or to explain to the whole class how they are addressing a problem or figuring a solution for a problem. And the more this happens, the better skilled everyone becomes at anticipating student thinking, and the better students get at intentionally solving problems in particular ways. This is one of the major benefits of lesson study. Here's another quote from a teacher. So, the type of professional analysis and reflection on teaching practices is part and parcel of lesson study, and it leads naturally and organically to changes in the way teachers think about their practice and each other. Practice becomes less isolated and more shared, and the sharing becomes more focused on the most important aspects of teacher learning. The next phase is the reflect phase. And again, it's a reflection on that great data that came from the observing of the students during the research lesson. And teachers start asking questions like, based on what we observed, do we need to scaffold the learning differently? Do we need to pre-teach certain concepts in order for the concept we focused on to be dealt with better by students? Did we need to group students differently? Were our instructions clear? These are the kinds of reflection questions that teachers use to reflect on how well the research lesson went. And not shown necessarily in this slide is that sharing is also a part of this stage. We'll cover sharing more thoroughly in the face-to-face session, but in a nutshell, after a lesson study cycle, teachers share with others what they learned as a way of continuing to spread the professionalization of practice. It can be shared in writing, by a presentation, a conference, workshop. It's some kind of wrap-up of the cycle, a wrap-up of the process and the outcomes of the learnings of that cycle, and a celebration of the learning. So there are certain attitudes that seem to lend themselves to really good, positive lesson study experiences, and these are the ones that are pretty typically cited as very helpful for collaboration. When individuals have a learning stance, when they're open and curious, they just have a better experience. They have more interest in participation and in contributing to the lesson study cycle. Also being open to teamwork and having that sense of being a responsible and interdependent team member. And also a student-centered kind of focus. It's about the students primarily, and it's only about us as educators insofar as we can keep the focus on the students and help them reach their goals to the best of our ability. We'll also work a little more with this set of mindset items in the face-to-face session when we work on how to establish teams and think about who should be on lesson study teams. Here's another quote from a lesson study practitioner. And you can think of a business parallel to lesson study as quality circles, that system in which workers team up to improve production and improve quality by coming up with ideas that they can implement for better outcomes. It's the the kind of practice that really honors and respects the work and the knowledge and the experience of the people who are actually doing the work. And by its very nature, it lifts the professionalism of everyone involved. So if that kind of practice works well in the business world and in other professions, why not for us too? So let's think a little bit about some of the mechanics and operational and logistical aspects of lesson study. And one of the first things that we have to deal with is time. How much time does it take? So lesson study takes place over a series of meetings with a certain number of meetings for each stage of the cycle. And the first time that a team undertakes lesson study, it's pretty common for there to be a couple of extra meetings because of the fact that people are learning the process as a new experience at the same time you're carrying out the actual work. So the first cycle of lesson study can be a little bit longer than a cycle undertaken by an experienced group that already knows the drill. So once lesson study starts to feel more second nature to a group, the typical breakdown of meetings goes like this. To narrow down the topic and arrive at a focus for a lesson study cycle, it can take 3 or 4 meetings. You're looking at a lot of material, you're weeding out what doesn't apply, you're digging deeper into what does apply, and you're settling on a target area for the research lesson. For planning the lesson, it can take 3 or 4 meetings too. You're seeing where the lesson fits within your unit plan or course outline. You're coming up with a specific student learning objective. You're reviewing and selecting instructional materials and strategies. You're developing the lesson. And then you're spending that extra time to anticipate student responses for every key part of the lesson. And you're deciding what should be presented on the board or projection screen. You're also coming up with an observation plan to ensure that you collect the right and most helpful data during the observation. And you're doing a dry run, a run through of the lesson. So that can take about 3 or 4 lessons. For the next phase, for teach and observe, it's just part of a class period, the part of the class period in which the research lesson is delivered. And then finally, for reflection, it's 1 or 2 meetings depending on your timing. It's recommended that the team get together at least briefly as immediately as possible after the research lesson on the same day of the lesson for a kind of check-in and quick debrief that you can only do when things are really fresh in mind. And then if there's time for a full debrief and analysis on the same day, that's fine. But it's pretty common to have a follow-up meeting already scheduled just within a few days after the delivery of the research lesson for a more careful, deliberate review of the data collected from the observation. So all in all, the cycle takes around 10 meetings, give or take. And again, the first time you undertake a lesson study cycle, it may take an additional 2 or 3 meetings just because it's a new process. It is typically advised to conduct a couple of lesson study cycles per school year. And the reason is if you do only 1 per school year, it's hard to gain it's hard to use the experience that you gain from doing it the first time so that you experience it in a more effective and efficient way the second time. It takes about 15 hours total per cycle for experienced teams, and again, several more hours for first-timers who are learning as they're doing. It is recommended that for the first 2 or 3 go-rounds of lesson study, teams follow the steps and the protocols really faithfully. After that, you can get a little more creative with it, and be a little more flexible with it, as you gain more experience with it. Let's see. Also, I want to say something here about the types of teams that can be formed. So there are teams that are called horizontal teams, and that means, for any content area, teams of teachers who teach pretty much the same kind of content. They can be formed by a proficiency level or grade level, and that's the most common type of group and the easiest type of group to get on the same page quickly. There are also vertical teams where you have teachers who teach the same subject but at different levels. So it's cross proficiency level teams. And these kinds of teams work very well too. It's a powerful way for teachers to understand how a concept develops across levels. So teachers at lower levels see the importance and the place of their piece of the curriculum as they set the stage for students' future learning, and the teachers at the upper levels see how to connect their own instruction of new concepts to the models and examples from the lower levels. And then finally, there are interdisciplinary teams, teachers from different content areas who work on a common challenge. And some of the typical common challenges that they might address are writing and strategies for comprehension. They might work on things like technology, digital literacy, problem solving, those kinds of overarching aspects of learning that cut across all disciplines. Okay. So I've thrown a lot of information at you. What is coming to mind for you in terms of what the benefits of lesson study might be and what the challenges might be? Liberty, if you could open the chat pods, please. We'd like to get some feedback from you. What do you project as good stuff that could happen from lesson study, and what do you project as challenges or issues or concerns that could derive from implementing lesson study? I'd like to encourage everyone to share what comes to mind for you regarding benefits and challenges. Okay, I saw someone typing a bit ago, but nothing has appeared in the chat pod yet. Please feel free to share what thoughts come to mind. Thank you, Dana. Trust and relationships as a benefit, challenges, time and coverage, absolutely. And we will cover how to deal with time and coverage as part of the follow-up to this webinar. There's a homework assignment that you will hear about shortly that actually addresses time and coverage. Trust and good relationships as a benefit is an absolutely common and expected outcome of conducting lesson study. I hope we get a few more ideas out there, but let me share a little bit about the benefits. It really is a kind of practice that helps us educators practice what we preach in terms of lifelong learning. Students benefit short-term and long-term from the overall increase of educator continuous improvement. There's an increase in professional esteem that occurs as a result of participating in lesson study. There are many comments from many participants that indicate that they just felt more honored and respected as educators because of the professionalism of the process and the results that derive from it. Also, classrooms tend to become more student-centered. Okay, so more comments here. Working as a team. Let's see. John says it seems very time intensive, and that is certainly a possibility. But I think also if you do the homework assignment that is going to be described shortly, it's all about finding and making time for lesson study. I hope that people will see that it is much more doable than it may seem on the surface and at first blush. Also very much worth doing, but it is definitely time intensive. There's no question about that. I think the issue is it worth it, and is it effective enough to be worth doing? And most of the research says that the answers to those questions are yes, and that's a big part of why we are sharing lesson study right now. So more challenges that can come up. There's an occasional fear of being observed when the research lesson is being taught. There are occasionally some folks who have some reservations about that, but if the cycle is carried out appropriately and properly and according to the protocols, the clear emphasis on observing students as opposed to observing the teacher tends to override those kinds of things. Working as a team, Angela mentioned that as it's right between benefits and challenges, and it's actually both. You have multiple points of view to try to integrate into a research lesson, and that requires some good facilitation to blend all the good ideas that come out into one research lesson to try. Another challenge is that implementation can sometimes be a little superficial, and people give up too soon. Hitting a little bump in the road and then deciding a little too early that it's not worth trying to get over the bump again. Let's see, Arisha said, challenge time could be better spent on deeper level of engagement with students. I'm not not 100% sure where that's going, Arisha, but I would say that lesson study is about spending the time on a deeper level engagement with students. So maybe that's a challenge and a benefit at the same time. But in any case, it's not something that can be done super quickly or without a real effort. It does require time, and it does require a commitment, but the payoffs are generally pretty marvelous. Okay, let's see, we just did that. All right, so just a reminder about part 2 of the Institute. It's April 17th, 9 to 4, and you see the address there in San Bernardino. Please bring a laptop or a tablet or some kind of device if you have one. We will spend a fair amount of time looking at some lesson study resources online that aligned with the various parts of the day in which we cover the different steps and stages of lesson study. And the objective for the Institute is drafting an action plan for implementing lesson study by learning and doing it at your sites or in your regions. So there will be much more detail about the steps that are under each stage of lesson study, but the idea is that at the end of the day, you'll walk away with a pretty good action plan that you can use to think about making it work at your sites. So here's what we'll cover when we get together. Planning for change will take kind of an overarching view of what it means to do something significant and different. We'll look at how to form lesson study groups and how to keep them motivated and keep them going. We'll look at making and scheduling time for the meetings required to carry out lesson study, resources and technology that support the effort. We'll look at what kinds of standards and data to use to focus lesson study topics, the steps for developing the lesson plan and the plan that observers will use to collect data as they observe the research lesson. We'll look at conducting and debriefing the lesson itself, and underscoring almost all of those steps, what kinds of facilitation skills and protocols are necessary to keep the stages flowing well, and we'll talk about the kind of challenges that you've already brainstormed a little bit, and more that will come out during the face-to-face training, and how to address those challenges. So Liberty, if I could please ask you to upload the homework worksheet. I'd appreciate that. And then if you, so for participants, if you could please download the handout that Liberty just added. It's the 4th item in the list of handouts, called Post-Webinar Assignment. I would really appreciate it if you could do that homework assignment before you come to the face-to-face training. It's pretty critical that you do that, because it'll help the rest of the training day go much more smoothly and effectively if you are so prepared. Also, if you could just start thinking about ways to adjust or add to your professional development budgets to support lesson study, that would be good. You don't have to come up with any definitive plan, of course. For those of you who already have embedded um, meeting time for professional learning, that's a much easier task. For those of you that don't, it might require a little more creative adjusting of practice, but again, it's totally doable. Next, if you could just start thinking about which teachers or teams or departments or schools, depending on your context, which ones might be most genuinely interested in participating. It will be good for you to have that in mind during the face-to-face training. And then there is a link there to the Mills College Lesson Study Group, lessonresearch.net. That is a site that we will use throughout the training, and it would be to your benefit to be at least somewhat familiar with it before April 17th. So we're hoping that the work that we do results in a shift in professional development. These are some of the elements of the shift that we are shooting for. Essentially, we're looking to move away from kind of the one-shot learning with no specific upfront plan to implement and sustain what you've learned, to working as a group with a very clear plan to support and sustain what was learned. And all of these items are little elements of that bigger shift. Again, I'd like to point out the lesson study group at Mills College. If you're interested in doing a little advanced research, these are some really good things to take a look at. The Mills College site, this publication from the National Professional Learning Organization called Learning Forward. And there's a great book called Leading Lesson Study. That's great. And if you already know that you're really serious and you want to be as prepared as possible, I recommend that you invest in this book. It is just an excellent publication that holds your hand through every step of planning and implementing lesson study. So I hope to see you all on April 17th. Please encourage others to register. Register yourself if you haven't registered already. Add another member or two to your team. The more the merrier, and the teamwork aspect of this is really helpful for preparing for implementation. So with that, I will wish you a good rest of the afternoon and evening, and hope to see you in San Bernardino in a couple of weeks. All right, take care, everyone, and have a great rest of the afternoon and evening. Goodbye.
Thank you, Jacques, and I want to thank our audience for participating in today's webinar. I just want to remind you that the recording of this webinar will be available online on the California Adult Education website. If you have not registered for the in-person Lesson Study Institute in San Bernardino on April 17th, a link to register for this event and other upcoming TAP events is in the chat pod. And please share this registration link with any colleagues who would be interested in the Lesson Study Institute. After the webinar ends, an evaluation link will open on the screen, and we want to encourage participants to complete the evaluation as it supports our efforts of continuous improvement. I want to also remind folks that if there is a need for technical assistance or professional development, please contact CAP. A link to submit a support request is in the chat box. Thank you all, and have a great rest of your day.